Joining us now is Cole Stangler. He is a journalist based in Paris. Cole, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Cole, there have been strikes in France that apparently I'm just seeing that the transport union has said are not going to be stopping for the Christmas holidays. What's happening? What's Macron trying to push through? How long have the strikes been going on? How effective are they? And also, how do they relate to the Yellow Vest movement?
Lots of good questions there. This movement started on December 5th, so exactly a week ago, and this is in response to Emmanuel Macron's government's proposed retirement reforms. These reforms had been a part of Emmanuel Macron's program since he ran for president in 2017. We knew they were going to happen at some point during his presidency. The government released a report that included a number of different reforms earlier in the summer. And what we've seen now, after that report became public, was unions' response to what was in that. And so there are really three main points that are driving the anger here. Without getting into too much detail, there are three main points of this reform that are really upsetting people, that are mobilizing unions and not just unions in the streets. The first big point is that Emmanuel Macron wants to create what he calls a so-called universal system. France right now has 42 different pension schemes, covering some in the private sector. They're what are called special regimes. So these are basically union negotiated agreements that cover transport workers in particular, although other types of workers. You have public sector workers as well. Everyone has these different retirement regimes they're covered by, some of which have better benefits, relatively speaking, than others. Macron has proposed to merge these into one universal system. That's upsetting people that have currently benefits that provide, again, relative advantages. So transit workers in particular, public sector workers as well, teachers, hospital workers. That's one point. The second point is, as part of these proposed reforms, they've proposed hiking basically the earliest age at which one can retire and collect full benefits. Currently, that age is set at 62, although many people retire later. You can retire as early as 62 for most private sector workers. Government has proposed hiking that to the age of 64. And then the third point, again, kind of wonky, but important to note here in France, is the creation of what Macron is calling a points-based retirement system, effectively changing the calculation that is used to get benefits. Right now, France has a proponents of the current system called a solidarity-based system, where anybody who works in France pays a certain amount of their paycheck into funding Social Security. When they retire, they're getting money from Social Security that's based on most workers in the private sector. It's the best 25 years, the most highest earning 25 years of your career. You get a retirement check based on that. For the public sector, it's the last 6 months. And what Macron is proposing to do is to abolish, essentially get rid of that system and change it into what he calls a point system, an individualized system where you're collecting, quote unquote, points throughout your career. And a lot of the unions deem that to be a kind of individualization of the French system. Those 3 points have upset unions. And we saw the first national strike that was organized on December 5th, a week ago. You had 800,000 people turning out across the country, according to the police, 1.5 million, according to unions, one of the biggest union mobilizations that we've seen in some time in France. And subsequent to that, so since last Thursday, we've had rolling transportation strikes, and that's been led by workers at the SNCF, which is the French national railway system, which have induced disruptions across the entire system. Today, I think 1 in 4 long-distance TGVs is running. You also have disruptions in the Paris metro system, is another big transport system that's been affected by the strikes. And the train system is effectively paralyzed today in Paris. That's been going on since last Thursday. So in addition to these intermittent strikes, the transit strikes have been ongoing. There was another big national walkout that was organized earlier in this week on Tuesday, the 10th. And finally, you have another national walkout day that's been organized next week, next Tuesday, on what's that, December 17th, I believe. Next Tuesday, right, the 17th, a next walkout day.
How does this relate to the Yellow Vest movement?
Well, I think it relates in the sense that the Yellow Vest movement was a response to Macron's presidency and a certain style of governing, and also very specific policies that the government has approved. So Emmanuel Macron, when he came to power, his very first budget as French president, he went and abolished the wealth tax, turned it into a tax on property holdings. That wealth tax previously applied to anyone with assets over 1.3 million euros. So we're not just talking about wealthy people. We're talking about really the super rich in France. That was Emmanuel Macron's first budget. He went and did that. We've seen cuts in low-income housing aid. We've seen, and this is a very important point, I think, not necessarily cuts, but essentially a freeze in spending on public services. We've seen a situation in public hospitals that's degraded substantially in the last few years. You have hospital workers complaining about not having enough staffing. You have severe underfunding, and the Yellow Vests in a lot of ways were a response to this underfunding of public services, the sense of frustration at the government. The main measure, of course, the Yellow Vests was the fuel tax. This idea that they were being asked, regular people are being asked to pay, chip in an extra more money per month, while the super rich are getting a massive tax cut. That was a big part of the Yellow Vests. The retirement reform movement relates to that in the sense that what you have is people that are frustrated about what they see as a president who wants to undo a system that's proven effective, a redistributive system that provides benefits to the general public, and confronted with the president who doesn't appear to believe in those values. And so we're seeing that clash right now. And another point too that's really interesting here is that the strikes right now benefit from pretty substantial public support. Even before they started, I saw polls that said 6 in 10 people supported the strikes. I was just looking just now, and a poll that nearly 70% of the public says they support the movement. So despite all the transit hassles they're causing, people feel strongly about defending this retirement system.
Let's go to the kind of potential regrouping of the left in a minute, but placing Emmanuel Macron, both in terms of his sort of what I read is pretty persistent lack of popularity in France, and then the fact that this presidency, I mean, Justin Trudeau was kind of for a minute the sort of poster child of the sort of goofy, woke, pseudo woke kind of neoliberalism, and he's the guy who's going to save all of us, and for that sort of like dead neoliberal mindset. But Macron is really, I mean, I think partially just because objectively he's obviously a much more formidable person than a Justin Trudeau. But he has been the outlet for every type of projection, from the kind of like, the type of Democrats who sort of primarily reject Trump on aesthetic grounds more than anything else, it seems, or people who are, they don't want to sort of move us to the next phase of real 21st century problem solving. They want to kind of go back to the 1990s. And so he has been the sort of projection of fantasy and hope for neoliberalism, for a certain type of corporate globalization, for NATO, for the European project. And I guess I'm just curious, starting from the fact that he remains unpopular at home, how has this sort of rhetoric and sense of projection met up against reality across the board with him? I mean, even beyond the fact that obviously we on the left wouldn't like him, but just in terms of like what's actually happening here with this presidency.
Yeah, it's a presidency that began with a lot of optimism, and I think, as you're referring to, and really not just the beginning of his presidency, but really up until today, we see this kind of projection, not exclusively coming from French liberals and French business elites, but really from liberals across the world, looking at Macron as a kind of savior example for their world vision that seems to be crumbling because of pressure from a variety of different ways. But Macron's presidency, he's declined in popularity. There's been, I think, a brief recovery at this point a little bit over a year ago, but then that was just before the Yellow Vest movement, which saw his popularity decline further. This is someone, the current numbers, I think, are probably around less than 40% of the population. I think that's always an important point to make. We know how unpopular Donald Trump is in the United States. Again, that's relative because you look at France and Macron is more unpopular in France than Donald Trump is in the United States. I think that's a really important point to make. And I think it really goes back to it's a really simple point, but it bears repeating because I think a lot of the international commentators forget this point. But Emmanuel Macron never truly had a popular mandate to govern. He won the presidency because he was facing off against Marine Le Pen, a candidate from the far right National Front Party. And as much as people do not like Macron, fortunately, people in France continue to dislike Marine Le Pen a great deal more. And fortunately, I think in that showdown, Macron won the election.
Right.
The problem is that Emmanuel Macron has governed as if he has a massive popular mandate. He then won a significant majority in the National Assembly that was characterized also by the lowest turnout in the history of the Fifth Republic because people were fed up with the options on the table. And the problem with Emmanuel Macron's governing is that he's taken himself to have a much broader mandate than he actually has, and you see that even in the way that he handles negotiating his reform. So one important point about this retirement reform is traditionally in France, I should say in the last 15 years or so, when you're trying to impose potentially controversial reforms, whether it's retirement, whether it's on unemployment insurance, whether it's about labor law, etc., there's mandated collective bargaining with unions. And most French governments know that, okay, you're probably going to piss off the CGT, which is the union on the left, the main big union on the left in France. And Macron understood that. But what Macron has somehow managed to do as well, I think this really speaks to his governing strategy, is that he's managed now to lose the support of the biggest union in France, which is a really moderate centrist union over retirement reform, by essentially running roughshod over what they call their red line over this retirement reform, which is the idea of hiking the retirement age. And I think it really speaks to Macron's governance. They essentially decided they didn't need the support of the CFDT, or at the very least decided they could cross this red line and there wouldn't be consequences. And it shows, a lack of respect, I think, for even these moderate unions, where Macron was essentially, and his advisors take themselves to have this mandate where essentially they can go in and push these reforms across, no matter what the polls say, no matter what political parties say, and no matter what even the trade unions say, even the most moderate trade unions.
Let's go to the left in just 1 minute. But I mean, I was very happy to hear you reiterate the lack of popularity for Le Pen. So has the far right not been able to exploit this? As a lot of us were really scared that they would be able to, that critically support, that voting for Macron to prevent a catastrophe was simply delaying something that was inevitable unless the left got itself together. But just before we get to the left, I mean, you said they're unpopular.
Yeah, I think that's an important point about French politics too, that bears repeating, is that Macron is unpopular, but so is Marine Le Pen, is very unpopular. I think around 20% approval.
Great.
And the left is also very unpopular. Everyone, right. Everyone ultimately is really unpopular, which is frightening in some ways, but it also means that there's an opening for whatever force can somehow manage to assemble a coalition. But right now, the scene is very fragmented.
So what about the left reformulating itself? And I guess before we do that, could you talk a little bit about why the left has become why they are so unpopular, and give us both, I guess, why the Socialist Party has floundered so much, but also why, I mean, people forget in the last election, it was, Mélenchon was actually right on the heels of Le Pen and Macron, and it could have been Macron versus Mélenchon. So what's happened with Jean-Luc Mélenchon as well in terms of his formation?
To respond to the first part of your question, I think the Socialist Party has essentially imploded. They still exist on a local level, and that's important. We can get to that later maybe. But on a national level, the Socialist Party has seen a tremendous drop in support, and that's essentially tied to the extremely unpopular presidency of François Hollande, which is the president who preceded Emmanuel Macron. Hollande, who finished his presidency with around 4% approval rating, someone who came in with His famous line before being elected president was, "My enemy is finance," trying to come after Nicolas Sarkozy and kind of turn the page on the Sarkozy era, promising to reform the European Union, to rein in finance, to end caps on public spending. And essentially, Hollande's presidency did not mark any significant change in any of those fields. And furthermore, actually saw essentially what you could call an attack on trade union rights with labor law reforms. And important to note as well that towards the end of his presidency, Hollande's economic minister was, of course, none other than Emmanuel Macron. So that's how Macron gained popularity, or at least became well known as a public figure. The Socialist Party has really struggled to recover from that. People don't trust the Socialist Party. People felt like they had betrayed their values, and I don't think that that's going to change, at least for some time on the national level. As you referenced, the party on the left that carried the most energy, that had the most excitement in the last elections was La France Insoumise, the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's a deputy in the National Assembly now, who's the effective leader of the party. They had a lot of optimism coming out of that 2017 election. This is a question that's caused a lot of debate as well. I think there is some who feel that the party overplayed their hand, immediately calling for protests right away against Macron's reforms, extremely confrontational. And I think for some people, the feeling was this was kind of out of touch with what the electorate and what the French public was feeling coming out of this election cycle. They were just hammering Macron on every single point. And I think for some people, maybe the tone and also the constant trying to organizing of national level protests, not local organizing, but national protests, I think upset people. I think that's one thing, but I think probably bigger than that is the party has suffered from a lack of internal democracy, I think is another major point. There's been lots of interpersonal squabbling. And the third point, which probably is the most important one in my view, I think it's the biggest factor, is that there was this whole scandal involving the police raids that happened, I guess, last fall now, so November 2018, where there was an investigation into campaign financing that was carried out, and there was a police raid that was done on the France Insoumise offices, where Jean-Luc Mélenchon reacted very aggressively, fuming, screaming at the police. This is captured on, all the clips went viral on YouTube. There's one famous moment where he says, "The Republic is me," which is a reframing of the Louis XIV, the state, I am the state. Mm-hmm. And so Mélenchon kind of flipped out, basically. The clips went viral. And I think that really hurt his image, especially because it sounds silly, but Mélenchon had a lot of significant support from youth voters. And I think when you see those kind of clips going on social media and you saw the way that he was portrayed, it kind of really hurt his image. And he was essentially also alleging there was a plot to bring him down. And I think the way that France Insoumise handled that, essentially alleging that there was a state plot out to get them, I think didn't sit well with people. I think all that's really affected them.
I guess I don't know anything about it, but I will say, there certainly we saw in Spain some actual very aggressive state targeting of Podemos, and that absolutely did happen. That's on the public record. And, it's a very different context, but we've certainly seen with Lava Jato attacking left leaders, most infamously the political imprisonment of Lula. Sure. So I do want to say that when I saw that happen, I don't know enough to comment, but I didn't have the instinctive like, oh, well, that's ridiculous. It was like, I don't know. Look, I've seen it happen. I had a friend on a local level working for healthcare expansion. The Koch brother group tried to do that to him. This happens. So, who knows?
Yeah, and those are, this is my essential, my take on it, but I know that there are people that are big supporters of the France Insoumise who would disagree. That's certainly, Mélenchon has certainly tried to draw the links with what's happened to him with to Lula, to the situation with Podemos. There's also attacks that the Mélenchon followed up against the press and even good investigative left-wing outlets following that. alleging the press to be out to get him. And I think that attitude has rubbed people the wrong way.
Right.
But certainly there are people who disagree with me. There's no question.
So you're seeing, though, you have a great new piece in Jackman called "In Marseille, the French left is finally uniting." And it's just so interesting because one of the, we need in the United States and probably in the UK more of that sort of broader set of organizing, they'd say in the UK, like extra parliamentary pressure or whatever. And it seems like in France, there is all of these critical formations in terms of, you can get people to strike in France, which is mind blowing. You do have certain union power, and the political parties are where you really need strategic intervention because it's been in disarray, as you've documented. What's happening in Marseille that might be a roadmap for the left revitalizing itself across France?
Yeah, so this is ahead of the municipal elections. So basically the local elections that elect the town council and then the mayor as well, who's directly elected from the council in big cities. These elections are happening March 20th, and I was in Marseille to report, where there's a rare coalition of various left-wing parties that are joining together, running on a single ticket. So you have in this coalition the parties that we just discussed, the Socialist Party and France Insoumise, whose leaders do not like each other, to say the least, on the national level, who are constantly or who have repeatedly criticized one another and each other's parties on the national level, working together in Marseille, along with the Communist Party, which has also had its issues with La France Insoumise, and then a whole array of other smaller formations, including Génération, which is the party of Benoît Hamon, who was the socialist candidate in the 2017 presidential election, who then left the Socialist Party to form his own group, which is also part of the DiEM25, Yanis Varoufakis' pan-European movement. So in any case, you have these different formations in Marseille working together on the local level to have a single ticket for the municipal elections. And it's important to stress that in general in France, municipal elections do encourage parties to work together. What's interesting about Marseille is, one, the scale. Marseille is the second largest city in France. It's a huge city. And then secondly, I think that also the scale of the cooperation too is very impressive in Marseille. The fact you have the Socialists and France Insoumise working together, so Mélenchon's party and the Socialists in this coalition together. And Marseille is also a very politically interesting place. It's a city that it's a city that's heavily working class, that has a strong minority populations as well, people, North Africans, and also French people with North African descent, big immigrant population. It's a city that in 2017 voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon in the first round of the election. And then if you looked at recent elections, the city has, I think in the most recent European elections, the National Front actually came in first in the European elections, which is to show you the difference that turnout makes really in that city. And Marseille is also, lest I forget, a city that's been governed by a mayor who's been at the helm for more than a couple of decades, who's now 80 years old, extremely has faced a lot of allegations of corruption and clientelism. Mm-hmm. And what happened in Marseille to really spur this left-wing coalition to working together was you had a collapse of two different buildings in downtown Marseille, which ended up killing 6 people. And that episode that was last year really drew attention to public housing, the state of housing in the city overall, and really in a more general sense, the city's neglect for its least well-off residents, for its working class residents who are make up a huge proportion of the city. Absolutely.
What is the role of the Green Party in all of this? They play such a contradictory role. I mean, I think actually clearly emerging across most of Europe is some type of kind of centrist formation. What is their role in this alliance in Marseille?
Well, the Green Party in Marseille does not back the left coalition. They're running their own candidate, at least for the moment. Perhaps that could change in the coming months. Again, we have until March, and you maybe could have a situation where there's 2 rounds of voting. So each list that has more than 10% can make it to the second round. In theory, you could imagine a scenario in which the Green Party gets 11%, this left coalition gets 15%, I don't know, and then they can merge. So there is a possibility for them to merge, but the Greens have not backed this coalition so far. And the thinking is this kind of comes out of their the wave of elation that they're riding following the European elections,
right?
In which they had a higher than average score. But there's a lot of doubt over how sustainable this is. The Greens were kind of an option for frustrated Macron voters. For some voters in the left, it saw no option in the European election. Those elections also have relatively low turnout. So it's totally unclear whether the Greens are actually going to be a force to be reckoned with in the long term. There's also been talk to bring things back to the national level. Mélenchon has even proposed an alliance with the Green Party, which is something that he absolutely was opposed to at the beginning of Macron's presidency back in 2017. Mélenchon has proposed the idea of a joint France Insoumise Green coalition. I was just reading a new book that's out by a deputy from France Insoumise, who's sort of the kind of a Michael Moore of France. He's been compared to François Ruffin, who's a documentary filmmaker who's elected with France Insoumise, who's very popular, and he talks about the need to bring red and green together. So, the Greens are certainly seen as a force to be taken seriously on the national level. And just maybe to finish as well, following this, to bring it full circle here, is this movement against retirement reform is really interesting in that it's actually bringing together trade unions, and it's actually bringing together left-wing parties in the streets. The socialists are against the retirement reform. The Greens are against the retirement reform. So is France Insoumise. So is the anti-capitalist left. And all these parties are together in the streets. And I think it was yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, it might have been Tuesday night in Saint-Denis, so a suburb just north of Paris. There was a panel that was organized that for the first time brought together all these parties on the same panel, which might sound silly and meaningless to outside observers, but in France, it's a big deal where you have this vicious infighting between these various forces. They were all together earlier this week, and supposedly they've agreed to also join together on next Tuesday. So what's kind of ironic here is that Macron is bringing together right. Trade unions and bringing together the left in a way that they weren't, in a way that, when it wasn't happening several months ago.
So that would be his greatest contribution to French and international politics.
Perhaps.
Cole Stangler, the pieces in Marseille, the French left is finally uniting. Follow Cole. We'll have a link to his Twitter where you can do all things left, French, and labor internationally. Cole, I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.